Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. So today we are going to have our second talk, and the talk will be by Dr. Nida Kirmani. And Dr. Nida Kirmani is an associate professor of sociology in the Mushtaq Ahmad Kirmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS. She is also faculty director of the Saida Wahid Gender Initiative. Dr. Kirmani has published widely on issues related to gender, Islam, women's movements, development and urban studies in India and Pakistan. She completed her PhD in 2007 from the University of Manchester in sociology. Her book, Questioning the Muslim Woman, Identity and Insecurity in an Urban Indian Locality, was published in 2013 by Routledge. Her current research focuses on urban violence, gender, and insecurity in the area of Lyari in Karachi, and she'll be presenting one of the papers from her research as well. And I must mention that we are really very happy to have you, ma'am, and it took us 4 years to bring you back to PIDE, so I hope you won't take longer in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope so.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Fahad. Thank you, Dr. Saab. Thank you, Dr. Saiba. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you giving me your time. Friday afternoon is a tough time for everyone. I know everyone's tired after a long week. Lekin aaj mera jo paper hai, it's about a little bit of a lighter topic. And I'm going to be honest with you, I have mixed feelings about this paper. It's kind of a weird thing to say about one's own research. I'm very conscious of, every argument has limitations. So I'm conscious of the limitations of this work, but I also think it's important for us to talk about this aspect of feminism. So I think feminism overload to nahi hua hai, lekin काफी सारा feminism PIDE में आज discuss किया गया, which is, from what I understand, not common at PIDE. So that's great. Your second presentation, unfortunately I missed the first one, but I am aware of Dr. Afia Zia's work, and this paper is very different from that. So मेरा जो previous काम था, I've worked on the women's movement, India में और Pakistan में, and I've looked at the relationship between women's movements and Islam, and how women's movements have navigated religious discourses, whether they've engaged with Islam or not, when, why. Lekin, personally, I felt, at least for me, I got a little bit tired of being trapped in this kind of Islam, secularism, Islam, secularism. मुझे लगा कि बहुत सारी चीज़ें उसकी वजह से शायद हम miss कर रहे हैं. So the paper is a bit of a thought experiment. It's an idea that I had based on my fieldwork in Lyari. So I've been working in Lyari for the past 7 years. मैंने 2012 से अपना काम शुरू किया था वहाँ. And initially मेरी जो research है वो conflict पे थी. So many of you know Lyari की history, and you're aware कि वहाँ काफ़ी violence हुआ है between criminal gangs, political parties, and law enforcement agencies. और कल मैंने जो talk की थी, and a few people in the audience were also there, so they're aware of that work. It's very different from the talk that I'm going to give today, but I think if we place this within that context, it will help us understand kind of the trajectory of my research and how all of these different aspects of urban life fit together. So I am a sociologist, लेकिन मेरा जो method है वो ज़्यादा anthropological है. I do ethnography. I spend as much time as I can in this place, in this part of Karachi. Obviously मैं लाहौर में रहती हूँ ज़्यादा, तो it's limited how much time I can spend there, but whenever I get time, I spend time in Lyari. तो 7 साल मुझे हो गए हैं और अभी तक की research complete नहीं हुई है, but hopefully someday there will be a book. The paper that I gave in 2015 in this very room was about local media there, and media का जो violence में क्या role है Lyari में. And if you can imagine, वो अभी तक paper publish नहीं हुआ है, 3 साल से वो in process है, and it will be out very soon. This paper that I'm presenting today is also accepted in a journal, South Asia, and it should be out, who knows, maybe in 2 years, 3 years, like, and the paper has been accepted, so that's a good thing. But I'm open for comments and discussions, and I would love to hear your critiques, and I'm sure इस पे हम debate कर सकते हैं in the question answer. So I'll read from the paper. I'll also बीच में मैं थोड़ी सी explain भी करती रहूँगी. अगर आपको कोई बात समझ में नहीं आए, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask a question. I really don't mind at all. I actually like it a lot. So just make sure that you're following along if I use some kind of term that you're not familiar with, because I understand कि मुख्तलिफ disciplines से लोग यहाँ आए हुए हैं, and maybe जो anthropology और sociology की ज़बान है वो शायद who knows. इतना वैसे I write very simply, so it's not very complicated. But in case I use a word that you don't understand, please stop me. So I'll just begin. The densely populated, multi-ethnic, and largely working-class area of Lyari in Karachi is one of the city's original settlements. The area has been infamous for a site of ongoing conflict between parties, criminal gangs, and law enforcement agencies. And yesterday I talked about how all three of these different groups were intertwined. So they weren't actually separate from each other. And the impression we get is that they are separate, but they're very much a blurry line between all of these three different groups. But for people living in Lyari, I think they're tired of hearing about how violent their locality is. So this paper also comes from that. क्योंकि मेरे जो वहाँ दोस्त हैं, they're like, you know, लियारी में बहुत कुछ हो रहा है, लेकिन आप लोग सिर्फ violence के बारे में बात करते हैं. Lyari is much more than a violent space. And I know that because I spend a lot of time there. It's also a very fun, vibrant, exciting part of the city. So this paper is an attempt to look at that aspect of life there. So this paper explores the multiple ways in which women and girls experience and understand their part of the city, and in particular whether or how they experience fun or enjoyment. So the paper is about fun, enjoyment, maza. I argue that focusing on the pursuit of fun and enjoyment can be an important way through which women push against and challenge patriarchal boundaries, even if these acts may not always fall squarely into the category of what we generally think of as political resistance and academic discourse. So I'm arguing that हमारी जो definition है politics की, उसको हमें expand करने की ज़रूरत है. और कल भी कुछ दोस्तों से बात हो रही थी कि, you know, why are young women not so involved in political discussions? I think also the way we understand politics maybe also should expand, not just to talking about political parties or the kind of technical aspects of political science. लेकिन everyday life में भी politics होती है. I mean, हर act में, I always say there's nothing that's not political. Everything you do and say is political in some way, in the sense that everything is related to how power is operating in society. So taking that kind of expansive definition of politics, this paper is looking at how everyday acts that women and girls undertake might also be understood as a kind of feminist politics. So based on extensive interviews and participant observation in several neighborhoods, the research shifts attention from solely using violence as a lens to understand urban space, an approach that has so far dominated studies of Karachi in general and Lyari in particular. So ज़्यादातर जो अभी तक research हुई है कराची पे सिर्फ violence पे focus रहा है. So this is kind of trying to shift away from only looking at violence. Rather, by focusing on the multiplicity of meanings space holds for women and girls, and by highlighting their own creative navigations and uses of space, this paper brings new insights into discussions of gender, urban space, and experiences of marginality. So Karachi, Lyari is located in Karachi's District South, and it's huge. It's population of about 1.5 million. It's extremely diverse. It's not one neighborhood. It's probably 20, 30 neighborhoods, all kind of bunched together. It's known as one of the no-go areas of Karachi. This is stigma for the people of Lyari, a label that they also would like to resist. And much of my work also explores the experience of living in a stigmatized space, a space that people think of as a no-go area. Lyari के जो लोग हैं वो अपनी locality या अपनी area को कराची की माँ कहते हैं, because Lyari is one of the original settlements of the city. Karachi की बुनियाद वहाँ रखी गई थी. In the 17th century, fishing communities were there. People migrated there from what is now Balochistan and other parts of Sindh and settled there, and Lyari grew from then. And then during the colonial period, it was turned into the port, and a lot of people migrated for work to work in the ports. So it is a historically working class area of the city, abhi bhi hai, but of course economic conditions have changed, so people are now what we would call the precariat. They're in precarious economic situations. So that's there in terms of the background. Lyari's negative image stems partially from the fact that it has been home to a variety of criminal groups, who have become increasingly powerful over the past decades. उसकी भी political एक कहानी है जो मैं आज आपके साथ नहीं discuss करूँगी, लेकिन discussion और question answer में हम उसको discuss कर सकते हैं. But yesterday's talk was more about that. Crime has always existed in Lyari, but things got much worse during the 1980s when Karachi politics as a whole became much more violent as a result of the Afghan war, the weapons that came in, the drugs that came in through Karachi. Karachi became a major node in these kind of smuggling networks, and politics as well became much more violent in the city as a result. During the 90s, crime and politics became much more closely intertwined. Again, मैंने कल उसके बारे में बात की थी. When I began my field work in 2012, Karachi was emerging from a period of heightened conflict between the two major political parties in Karachi at that time. अब तो situation काफी change हो गई है पूरे मुल्क में. But at that time, the PPP and the MQM were the most powerful parties in Karachi. MQM, of course, was the most powerful. PPP, उनका base हमेशा जब से PPP establish हुई है, was always Lyari in Karachi. So the criminal gangs were also associated with the PPP. So during my first 5 years in Lyari, I worked mostly on residents' experiences of violence in that part of the city. And a lot of the work that I've published so far, some of you might have seen it online, is about the experience of young Baloch men living there, their experience of fear in the city, how their mobility was restricted at that time because of the fears coming from the conflict between the MQM and the PPP. I've written about resistance, protest. I've written about the media. And it's all been somehow related to violence. I've also written about women and domestic violence. So again, violence. So I wanted to come out of the violence a little bit and talk about some other aspect of urban life. At the same time, one of my main purposes of conducting research, as is the goal of most ethnographers, is to complicate the way people understand this particular space and move away from only looking at Lyari through the lens of violence. However, after every presentation that I've made, people often respond by asking me, how do you get there? Or remarking, wow, you're so brave, आप वहाँ कैसे काम करती हैं, वहाँ कैसे जाती हैं, जैसे कि वहाँ पता नहीं इंसान नहीं रहते हैं, मैं किसी दूसरी दुनिया से आई हूँ. So people don't understand. Of course, you're also presenting in elite spaces. तो even अगर मैं कराची में हूँ और मैं हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी में present कर रही हूँ. So a lot of people wouldn't regularly be going to this part of the city. So they see it as this kind of fearful space, and they don't understand how somebody like me could spend so much time there and feel comfortable there. So I realized that through all of my research on violence, even though I was trying to complicate the idea of Lyari, I was reinforcing a certain kind of stereotype about the place, which many of us end up doing in our research inadvertently. So perhaps this was a limitation in my own methodology or writing, but this is also a limitation in terms of how researchers, particularly those studying the poor, urban women in the global south, are often compelled to only ask particular questions and to frame their research within certain limited categories. So because we've been trained in a certain kind of tradition, we always look for poverty, we look for violence, we look for conflict, and we begin with a certain set of assumptions, and then our research moves on from there. So we end up kind of reifying or simplifying what are very complex social spaces. So if one is writing about violence, how do you also write about all of those moments when violence isn't taking place, right? And if one is researching gender-based oppression, how do you include all of those moments where women are neither being oppressed nor necessarily actively resisting power structures, which is the majority of time? Turning one's attention to women's experiences of fun and enjoyment helps to complicate reductive understandings of urban life, particularly in stigmatized urban spaces like Lyari. So why is it important to understand fun? Sociology as a discipline has historically tended to focus on only the negative aspects of cities as a result of industrialization, overpopulation, the housing crisis, poverty, conflict. All of these things are there, of course. But while the study of cities in the global north has diversified to looking at other aspects of urban life, studies of cities in the global south are often trapped within the framework of being in perpetual, almost apocalyptic crisis. This is particularly true for certain cities such as Karachi, which have come to have a certain kind of reputation in Pakistan and internationally. So this Karachi is only understood through the lens of violence. And while this research has been very, very valuable, I've of course learned a lot from it, I've contributed to it as well, The almost exclusive focus on violence has also led to a pathologizing of the city as only being defined by violence, with political ethnic violence receiving the most attention. So even if you're talking about violence, only a certain kind of violence gets talked about in Karachi, and that's the violence that involves political parties. Baki jo violence hai, let's say structural violence, the violence, economic violence that's taking place, violence experienced by women in private spaces, even that violence you're not speaking about, it's only violence that relates to the political parties. That's also reductive. While one cannot deny the existence of violence, an overemphasis on it excludes other key aspects of urban life and does not help us explain the wider context in which various forms of violence exist. Apart from complicating the discussion of third world cities and Karachi, even in the literature on third world women, and Muslim women specifically, there is an obsession with the idea of oppression, women in the burqa, women, behind the parda, and how do we get them out of that? And this assumption that these women are necessarily oppressed, and that defines their entire life. So there's no more, which isn't to say that these things aren't an issue or a problem, but how do we understand women's lives in a more complex way than just through this kind of lens? So the discourse is present in studies produced about Muslim majority contexts in the global north, but also we reproduce it in the Pakistani context, right? So especially elite researchers who go into spaces like Lyari come with their own set of assumptions about the women there are necessarily oppressed, or hum usko rescue karne aa rahe hain. And people have that assumption about me as well. When I go to Lyari, people who are from the elite class will say, aap unki help karne ja rahi hain, aap unki madad karne ja rahi hain, acha bahut acha kaam kar rahi hain. When that's really, nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, they've helped me a lot more, right? Because I'm writing papers, I'm going to conferences, I'm traveling all over the world, I have a good job at LUMS. So I'm benefiting from their stories. So this is you have to be honest about this. So I'm not going and giving them anything. Sometimes, I'll get involved in community projects and to the best of my ability, but this idea that I'm going to help them and save them is very, very problematic. And it does come into our research as well. So though I have also focused on the darker side of urban life in my previous research, this doesn't mean that fun and enjoyment were not there in the interviews that I was doing, even when I was talking to people about violence. In my research on women's employment and domestic violence, for example, some women mentioned enjoying not necessarily their paid work, but they also enjoyed the experience of getting out of the house, traveling to work, making new friends. These kinds of experience, even if their job was in many ways exploitative, they also enjoyed that space that they got from being able to get out of the house. For example, one of the young women I spoke to, Saima, who was in her early 20s and worked at Hyperstar in Dolman Mall, made the point to show me a series of selfies she had taken in the break room, wearing bright red lipstick to match her uniform. She was obviously proud of this. She felt happy about this aspect of her job, even though other aspects of her job might not have been as fun. So there was this aspect of fun and enjoyment was always there, but I never actually focused on it in my work. Apart from the importance of talking about fun just because it exists and because it complicates our understanding of cities and of women's lives, one of the questions this paper explores is whether the pursuit of fun and enjoyment can be thought of as a political act, and whether in particular it can be categorized as feminist. And that's something I'd like to discuss more. And other researchers have looked at this. So this paper takes a broad approach to pleasure and includes any act through which women individually or collectively experience enjoyment. So I'm inspired in this work by the work of another scholar called Laleh Khalili, who's worked on Beirut and on Palestinian women there. And she talks about the experience of refugee women in Beirut, navigating the city, going to the promenade, enjoying themselves in a context where they're otherwise quite marginalized. And this, for her, is an act of resistance. This is kind of a political act for them as well, even though we might not understand this as a political act. So in the case of Palestinian women in Beirut, and also in the case of women in Lyari, the pursuit of enjoyment is an opportunity for collective conviviality, socialization, happiness, enjoyment, in an otherwise challenging and often atomizing context where conflict also makes people isolated from each other. In the South Asian context, we've seen the work of, there's a famous book called Why Loiter, by Shilpa Phadke, Samira Khan, and Shilpa Ranade, who've talked about the importance of loitering, women hanging out in public space with no purpose, which we see men doing in our cities all the time, in a non-productive, non-consumptive manner. So not being in public space to buy something, to go shopping, to go to the mall, or to be in the market, but just to be in public space to occupy that space. And how that is also a kind of political act for women in a context where women do not have that kind of freedom or mobility. So in their book, they talk about that. So if we talk about what's included in fun, this is Asif Bayat, who's an urban anthropologist, and he talks about all of the ad hoc, non-routine, and joyful conducts that might be included under the definition of fun, like joking, dancing, social drinking, playful art, music, sport. Let's just keep going. So how all of these things could be also classed as fun, and how these are important parts of understanding everyday life and urban life in general. So these authors subsume fun under the broad umbrella of pleasure and argue that pleasure undermines the very possibility of order and control. Right? So in a society where you're constantly being controlled by various powerful actors, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's capitalism, whether it's the state, in that kind of atmosphere, these acts of enjoyment are in many ways disorderly acts that are resisting this kind of dominant for these dominant forms of oppression. So women having fun, especially in public spaces, is often viewed as threatening because it challenges the notion that women's presence in public is only acceptable when she has a purpose, when she's taking her child to school, when she's going to the market, whether she's going to her place of work. She should only be in public if she's going someplace and doing something. Otherwise, she's up to no good. So in the following section, I focus on a selection of episodes of fun and enjoyment that I observed while spending time with young women from mixed ethnic backgrounds, belonging to what could loosely be described as the lower middle class in Lyari. This paper approaches fun and enjoyment through James Scott's idea of infrapolitics, which refers to small, everyday actions of refusal and resistance, and argues that these small acts can also have wide-ranging effects on the organization of power relations. So his famous book is Weapons of the Weak. Some of you will be familiar with that, where he talks about peasant resistance and how in these small acts of resistance, peasants, I think in Indonesia, were resisting their masters. So while the pursuit of enjoyment can both purposefully and inadvertently push the boundaries of dominant gender regimes and hence be classified as feminist resistance, this isn't always the case. So I'm not saying every time a woman pursues enjoyment, this is a kind of resistance. Sometimes this also feeds into certain kinds of gender stereotypes and regimes, so we can look at that as well and talk about in what instances might this be seen as resistance, in what instances might we see this as conforming to dominant norms. An analysis of these episodes highlights the multiple meanings enjoyment can hold for women and disturbs the simplifying binaries of resistance and submission, violence and peace, and reflects the complex negotiations that characterize the rich texture of everyday life in marginalized and conflict-affected urban localities. It is through these types of everyday negotiations that gender orders are both reinforced and challenged. So as a researcher who's been attuned to looking for violence, it took me a while to adjust my focus in order to see the enjoyment that was happening around me. This problem was made worse by the fact that the people I encountered were not used to being asked about this aspect of their lives. Even the women who I was spending time with assume कि मैं उनसे violence के बारे में बात करना चाह रही हूँ, या गुर्बत के बारे में, या all of the kind of oppressive factors. So it was difficult to get people to even kind of talk about this. So rather than talking, it was more important for me to just kind of observe. So when I spent time with this young woman who helped me with the research, Hina, in her neighborhood, the picture I saw was very different from the picture that I, was given to believe that this place was very oppressive. Of course, the women in this locality were restricted in terms of their mobility. But once I entered the narrow gullies of her neighborhood, there were a lot of women loitering in front of their houses, chatting away, smoking hookahs. So they were kind of using their locality as a space for enjoyment as well. They would go to the rooftop, light chali jati thi, gather together, have lots of gossip sessions, enjoy themselves, get out of their house. And that was actually a time, even though of course nobody enjoys load shedding, but that also gave women an opportunity to get out of the house and get away from their chores because they couldn't do their work in the house without electricity. So it gave them a break and an opportunity to socialize. Apart from these everyday moments of conviviality or enjoyment, women would use the opportunity provided by religious festivals and rituals to also get out of the house and enjoy something you can see across the subcontinent, not just in Pakistan, not just in Karachi. For example, visiting a shrine might be an opportunity to also get out, enjoy yourself, and then go to the space where you meet other people. Ramzan also provides a time of relaxation of social norms, in Lyari at least, where women are out all night wandering the streets. This would not be possible any other time of the year. So it's kind of a party-like atmosphere, which isn't particular to Lyari, but is common in kind of working class neighborhoods across the city. Ramzan provides a legitimate excuse to go out with friends and family members for women, often under the pretense of shopping, even if they're not shopping, but more often just to wander around and enjoy the sights and sounds of the streets. Very often, the pursuit of enjoyment is something women and young women do on the sly. They have to sneak around in order to have fun. So in this way, they're not openly challenging restrictions, but using space within the bounds of accepted social norms to their own advantage. So how are women using clothing, for example, as a way of providing opportunities for mobility? Everyone sees the burqa as something oppressive, but for many women, the burqa is a means of actually having more mobility because it allows them to navigate urban space in a way that otherwise would not be acceptable to them. So it's not necessarily something you have to see only as being a source of oppression. Many women are creative with the way that they use these kinds of restrictive garments. Women also push the boundaries of cyberspace. This is something very interesting. I was talking with friends last night as well about TikTok. However, it's still not acceptable for young women in Lyari, like most young women, in the kind of middle class, lower middle class, to have a Facebook account, for example. But they still do. They use different kinds of photos. This is common everywhere. But then they use cyberspace as a way of also exploring different aspects of their identity, having different kinds of relationships that might not be acceptable in the offline space. So they're using this as and of course all women don't have access to it, so they borrow, they share a phone between members of the family, and they use these kinds of new opportunities to explore different aspects of their identity. So while access to technology is limited, it's more widespread in middle and lower middle class localities such as Lyari than one might expect, and is radically transforming social relationships and opening up new possibilities for the experience of enjoyment for young people in general. So, I talk about going on an outing with a group of women that I spend a lot of time in a vocational center in Lyari where women come to take computer classes and sewing classes. So I went out with them on an outing. They went for a picnic to Kinjar Lake, which is like about an hour outside of Karachi. So this was just a day trip, but I enjoyed with them and also saw how moving through these spaces, they were able to relax a lot of the social norms that they had to abide by in Lyari. The clothing, otherwise this young woman would be wearing a burqa in Lyari. As we moved further away from the locality, they were able to relax and let go a little bit more. And this provided a space of freedom for them in a context in which otherwise they were quite restricted. So when I went there, I dressed like I'm dressed now, and I looked really drab, and the other young women were all dressed up and wearing makeup and high heels, and I was thinking, how are you going to go to the lake? And all of the sites we're supposed to go to wearing these very uncomfortable high heels. But this was an opportunity for them to really let go and enjoy in a context where otherwise their life was pretty restricted. So although on normal days most would be wearing a black burqa, very few were wearing them on this day. Only one of the women kept her niqab on all day, and she was taking selfies throughout, which everyone else found very funny. The women were, messing around with men, kind of teasing guards, teasing people when they were out, really like acting in a way they wouldn't be allowed to do so in Lyari itself. So there was a freedom these young women had when they were away from their own neighborhoods. They didn't seem to care what people were saying or thinking about them, which wasn't possible when they were closer to home. they seem to be relishing this kind of freedom. So here you could see young women, piled on a motorbike, going around the lake. I call her Risha. She kept standing up in the boat when we were on the lake, spreading her arms out, screaming at the top of her lungs, really embarrassing the rest of us, attracting a lot of attention, but she didn't care, and she never would act this way in her own locality. Flirting with random guards, police officers, in a way that she couldn't do in her own neighborhood. So the women on this trip were using this as an opportunity to really push the boundaries in a way they wouldn't be allowed to otherwise. The enjoyment of dressing up and taking selfies was clear over the course of the day, but one could argue along the lines of Leila Abu Lughod has also argued that this kind of enjoyment might reinforce restrictive gendered consumer culture. So that's one way of looking at it, that places pressure on women to conform to a particular kind of beauty standard. But at the same time, this could also be viewed as an important means of self-expression for these young women in a context where women's sexuality in particular is constantly policed and controlled and could even be viewed as risky considering the chances of photos being leaked. So of course you can't tell who she is from this, but they were taking lots of photos. And we know how photos also get used and misused in our context, especially when it comes to women. So they were taking risks as well. Secondly, the reason why the young women from the vocational center were able to let loose was because they were away from the prying eyes of the people in their own neighborhood. This gave them the freedom to take off their burqas, dress up, laugh out loud, flirt with strangers, and generally be irreverent. This provided a break from women who were otherwise constantly surveilled. While this didn't necessarily challenge gender norms, it was precisely the exceptionality of this event and its geographical distance from their homes that allowed for the possibility of the freedom to enjoy. While the young women on the picnic were in some senses challenging gender norms, they were doing so away from people in their families and their neighbors. These momentary suspensions, though exceptional in some senses, may also give these women the confidence to push boundaries when they're back home in their everyday lives. So once they've tasted this kind of freedom, maybe this will also inspire them to push boundaries more when they return. On another day, and this is another group of women that I look at, there's a space called the Lyari Girls Cafe. So they go on these cycle rides every Sunday, and this is very rare. Lyari mein to it's really uncommon. Generally in Karachi, you rarely see women, except ye upper class jo group hai apna, critical mass. They go on cycling rides, but you never see women from the lower middle class riding bicycles. So this might have been more common in the past, lekin ab aapko nahi nazar aata hai. So Sameen is 19 and Maham is 25, and both work for a community organization called Lyari Girls Cafe, which is an NGO that offers classes to girls and women in the area. The Lyari Girls Cafe started organizing bicycle rides every few Sundays last year, which was a deliberate effort to claim public space for women and girls. This echoed the efforts of another group, Girls on Bikes, but that group was mostly made up of upper class women in Lahore and Karachi. Lyari Girls Cafe, on the other hand, catered to women from the lower middle class communities in Lyari. While the act of cycling may not seem particularly controversial, it is actually quite controversial in this locality. So for this reason, riding bicycle has come to hold a kind of symbolic value when it comes to women asserting their agency and the right to occupy public space. It's also just simply a source of enjoyment. So when they first started to ride their bikes, the members of the Lyari Girls Cafe were met with resistance from the local branch of the Jamaat-e-Islami, which you all know. And although they still reportedly faced a great deal of harassment, over time they were able to carve out a space for themselves. More recently, Sameen and Maham have started taking their cycles out, just the two of them, which they found both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. While Sameen's family didn't mind her cycling, Sameen Maham would have to sneak out early in the morning to avoid her male cousins, especially. I spoke to them about why cycling was so important, and just as a side note, this is one of the women from the group. These are her photos. So she's a very talented photographer, and she was kind enough to share her photos with me, and her name is at the bottom, Rimsha Raheen. So I spoke to Sameen and Maham, and I asked, why is cycling so important to you? So they said, first of all, we stay fit by cycling. Second reason is we have found a solution to the pollution problem, which we really made. There's a lot of pollution. And what is important is then when we cycle, we feel a sense of freedom. We come very close to freedom, and in the fresh air, early in the morning, we really like cycling, and then we feel empowered. And ये उर्दू में interview किया था, obviously, अंग्रेजी में translate किया, अब मैं उर्दू में उसको दोबारा translate कर रही हूँ. And empowered was actually a word they used in English. And often we hear people say, Lyari isn't defense, matlab the men on the street who are harassing them. So we say, even if we go to defense, what will be different from Lyari? We say we want Lyari to stay as Lyari. We don't want to make it defense. If girls are cycling on the streets, why are you saying it's like defense? And then I just inform them that defense mein bhi nahi hota. Actually, defense mein aapko bahut kam auratein nazar aayegi on the street, much less than in Lyari. So people will say, Samin said, people will say this is Naya Pakistan, sarcastically. Ye Naya Pakistan hai, when they're cycling around. To tons mein. To maa hum kehti hai, tabdili aa gayi hai. And someone else said, Baji, you are a girl, you aren't a boy, why are you cycling? And I said, Bhai, why are you cycling? This is a sport for girls now. As compared to the picnic, there's much more clear articulation of resistance in these narratives. Ye conscious act hai inke liye, where the women on the picnic weren't consciously doing anything in terms of resistance. While many of the justifications they were giving me were read as attempts at legitimizing their behavior in a socially acceptable manner, hum exercise ke liye kar rahe hain, hum pollution kam karne ke liye kar rahe hain, there was also an explicit articulation of a feeling of freedom and empowerment when they cycled, an opportunity to breathe in an otherwise stifling environment, which demonstrated the inextricable link between the pursuit of enjoyment and their assertion to the right to the city, which David Harvey calls the right to the city, which the marginalized don't have otherwise. The fact that they are doing this in their own locality, under the disapproving gaze of male family members, underlined the boldness of their assertion. While the women going on the picnic were going outside and then letting go, these women were doing it in their own neighborhood. At the same time, while they at times cycled in their own neighborhood, they still preferred to go outside of Lyari and cycle there. They went out early in the morning, jab kam log hote the, especially jab kam mard hote the on the street. So they still found ways of protecting themselves a little bit. And most of the young women you'll see in this photo are actually very young. They're not women over 18, 19. Though for most women, the reality is after their 20s, when they become in a marriageable age, तो फिर ये चीजें उनके लिए acceptable नहीं होती हैं. So there are limitations to this. This is not like a freedom story only. So just in conclusion, while women and girls find opportunities for fun and enjoyment in multiple spaces, in the gully, on the roof, at a neighbor's house, in the mall, in the market, at a shrine, and in the virtual space of Facebook, WhatsApp, and TikTok, the common thread seems to be that most fun and enjoyment happens for women outside of their homes. This is unsurprising given the fact that home for the majority of women and girls is a site where they face the most amount of social restrictions from their male and elder female family members. So this goes back to the idea of the importance of women occupying public space, because for women, public space also provides certain kinds of freedoms. At the same time, there are other kinds of risks there. But for the vast majority of women, the further they traveled from home, the more freedom that they felt they had. Returning to the original question, were these experiences of fun and enjoyment any more than a momentary break from an otherwise repressive environment? And did these episodes hold within them the possibility of actually transforming gender relations? While it is true that women's experience of enjoyment often took place during exceptional moments or in secret, and despite at times feeding into gendered consumerist desires, these moments can be viewed as providing openings for women to push back against very rigid gender codes. And ये debate literature में काफी हुई है in the left, literature in the left as well. Frederick Jameson has argued about the moralizing critique made by some within the left of pleasure as a justification for capitalism. So that's, there's always been a critique of fun even within the leftist literature. But Frederick Jameson sees the possibility, the allegorical potential of pleasure as a means of imagining the systemic revolutionary transformation of society as a whole. So for Jameson, actually, acts of fun and enjoyment could be opportunities to imagine a different kind of world. So he's not talking about gender relations, but we could expand this as well to talk about how gender relations could also be reimagined during these moments, during these exceptional moments. At the same time, in focusing on fun and enjoyment, one should be careful not to slip into romanticizing the lives of the poor, and that's something I'm very conscious of, which are fraught with very real restrictions in terms of their mobility, communities, and as society as a whole. For example, Saima, who I mentioned, or Hyperstar Wali, she was working there, and then she had to leave her job. By the time I finished this research, she actually had to leave her job because uski mangni ho gayi, and her fiance's family wouldn't accept the fact that she was working in this department store and having to interact with ghair mard. Sameen, one of the women in the cycling group, she actually stopped cycling because, again, the pressure became too much for her. One of the women kept going, one of the women dropped out. So these are the realities. So it's not as straightforward and simple as it might be appearing. Lyari Girls Cafe is constantly coming under criticism from people in the community. From there, just as a side note, the TLP won the election in the last election from their area. So the religious right is very strong in this part as well. So this is also reality. So they went to Aurat March. And we know Aurat March is mostly dominated by upper class women. But these women were also there, and they got a lot of grief when they came back to Lyari. Abhi tak log unko baatein sunate hain uske liye. So it's also worth noting that much of what I have described in this paper in terms of how women have fun is not unique to Lyari or Karachi or even Pakistan. So I'm trying to make a broader point here. One thing that is particular to Lyari is the fact that Lyari has been through a great deal of conflict. During those periods of conflict, women's mobility was doubly restricted. So 2013 ke baad jo operation hua hai, of course I'm very critical of the operation as well in the way that it's been carried out. But having said that, for people in Lyari, it's also the kind of public acts of violence have subsided, so there's more space for women to go out, and is tarah ki social activities aapko ab zyada nazar aa rahi hain. So for women, mobility is already restricted, but the conflict meant they were further restricted. So Lyari Girls Cafe wouldn't have been able to function at all during that time because unki neighborhood mein khas taur se bahut zyada violence thi. Finally, focusing on fun and arguing for a more complex understanding of marginalized urban spaces does not mean ignoring the issue of violence. Violence ek reality hai, ek haqiqat hai. We cannot ignore that, and I'm not arguing that we should. But like fun, violence is always a part of everyday life, whether it's the memory of past violence, the imminent threat of future violence, and whether it's physical, structural, or symbolic in form. And sometimes fun, and Oscar Verkaik has also written about how violence can be fun for certain groups of young men. We won't go there right now, but ye bhi ek argument hai. In an economically deprived area such as Lyari, which has experienced almost 2 decades of violence at the hands of multiple actors, and in the lives of women who constantly face the threat of violence in their daily lives, one cannot forget the fact that violence exists. However, exclusively focusing on violence puts forward an incomplete picture, including an analysis of other aspects of social life, such as experiences of fun and enjoyment, provides a more complex picture of the richness that constitutes urban life, and highlights the multiple ways in which women creatively negotiate within, around, and against various spatial and social boundaries, thus allowing space for the agentive possibilities of pleasure to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nida Kirmani, for a very fun presentation. We're going to have a question answer session. I would request you all to keep your questions a little short, and to please introduce yourself, identify yourself, and then ask questions. And we'll take questions in 2 rounds.
Only questions, not comments, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Only for questions, not comments.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Only on kiya hai.
Ivan Zaman Kakar from Anthropology Department. I have a brief comment. I failed to find any theoretical comprehension in this presentation, though you mentioned very illegal works of Asif Bayat, Bela Abulloho, Lale Khalili, and Oscar Warkaik. But if you say that it is an ethnographic work, an anthropological work, so there should be some anthropological, theoretical comprehension So I want to suggest you. नरेटिव रिसर्च में एक प्रॉब्लम ये होता है ना, ये मेरी अपनी राय है कि इसमें आर्गुमेंट जो है वो ज़्यादातर लॉस्ट हो जाता है। महम ये कहती है, सराज ने वो कहा, मेरे लिए फन ये है, काशिफ के लिए फन इससे मुख्तलिफ है, लेकिन लियारी के बारे में हमें कम समझ आ जाता है। 4, 5, 10, 15 नाम होते हैं, उसमें फिर बुनियादी बात जिस तरह आपने कहा कि फन अब हम जब उसके अब फन क्या है, फॉर एग्जांपल जैसे ऑस्कर वाइल्ड के लिए वायलेंस भी मिलिटेंट्स एंड माइग्रेंट्स में फन भी एक वायलेंस है। व्हाट इज नॉट फन? ये जो टोटलिटेरियन रीजन है, जिस तरह पावर है, पॉलिटिक्स है, जिस तरह आपने कहा ईच एंड एवरीथिंग इज पॉलिटिक्स, पॉलिटिकल, व्हाट इज नॉट पॉलिटिकल? ईच एंड एवरीथिंग बिकम्स रिलीजन। जिस तरह जब हम मुलाओं के साथ डिस्कशन करते हैं, एक मिनट,
This is not a break actually. See,
जब हम कहते हैं कि एथीज्म के to do not believe in God, वो कहते हैं कि ये भी एक रिलीजन है। तो what is not fun?
That's your question?
Yeah, one thing, what is not fun, and
This is not fun.
do women make a collective identity, and unified entity in Lyari?
Sorry, दोबारा
You didn't mention the divisions
जी जी
among women
जी
in Lyari.
जी
Women, girls, Baloch girls, Urdu speaking girls, poor girls, ये जो classes है upper, middle, lower, सारी girls को एक ही कैटेगरी के तौर पर पेश करना भी इस वक्त का एक पॉलिटिक्स है, I think. और ये जो गर्ल्स ये जो मोबिलिटी है उनकी, ये किस चीज में, कौन से फैक्टर्स है?
okay, now let her respond. Okay,
We'll
let
let
her
other
respond.
people ask. Will you respond or will it take 2 more questions for this round?
आपकी मर्जी है।
Okay. And, who wants to? Give it a back. Keep it short.
Please.
And
And
yes,
yes,
I was
must
teaching
be
urban
specific
economics
as
for
possible.
students for 3 semesters. So my question is, you are looking at
Speak a little louder, please. We can't hear
I
you.
think आपका mic शायद
my name is Habib Hassan, and like I was teaching urban economics to undergrad students for like 3 or 4 semesters. So my question is, we are looking to urban areas like this, these greater settlements in the cities from the lens of the downtowns. Like this is a concept like in history, which is presentism. We are looking past from the modern lenses. So my question is, looking at this theory by Edward Soja, which is social spatial dialect, which says that the space we create really matters creating the society over there. So how do you see, like, looking at the slums and the squatter settlements from this modern downtown's lens, creates problematic defining this fund, like he was referring. So as a policy recommendation, I want to ask, like, do you suggest reinforcing the fund which they are saying is fund based on their own social and spatial settlements, or we should reinforce this fund which we play in the like modern social places like in DHA and Peria and other places? So my just simple question is, rather we should reinforce the fund they are saying is fund, or whether we should export and fund to them. So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Very good.
Anyone else? Give this to this girl and.
मैं एक्चुअली जवाब देता हूँ ताकि फिर मैं भूल जाऊँगी ना, मेरी याददाश्त इतनी अच्छी नहीं है, एज मेरी ज़्यादा हो गई है। मैं रिस्पॉन्ड करती हूँ, फिर मैं आपका सवाल। Otherwise, you know, because Khan Zaman's and Habib's questions like were
Yeah, we will take more questions. Don't worry.
complicated. तो एक तो the theoretical contribution got lost, ये शायद ethnography में अक्सर हो जाता है कि हम stories बताते हैं और फिर I tried, शुरू में मैंने अपना argument दिया था, end में भी मैंने उसको दोहराया था, मैं आपको भेज सकती हूँ अगर आप ये clear नहीं है, but basically theoretically the contribution is coming at 2 sets of literature. Urban theory की जो literature है, especially on the urban poor in the global south, एक obsession है इस literature में सिर्फ violence पे, which is a kind of Orientalist understanding as well of cities in the global south as being perpetually in chaos, violence, and not understanding the complexity of the urban life there. जो feminist literature है उसमें भी एक हमेशा oppression और violence पे एक obsession है, or it also reinforces the idea that women are passive victims all the time. Not that women are complex agents as well, who in many ways, even if they're not out protesting, even if they're not member of a political party or political group, in small ways there are acts of resistance that we should take seriously in their everyday life. So ये एक theoretical contribution है, you don't have to agree with it or not, but it's something I think we should expand how we understand. Now, it's an important question, what's not politics, if everything's politics? I think that's a very valid point. I say everything is politics. What's not fun? Again, fun is very subjective. It's a feeling, it's an affect, as we say. Fun for one person can be misery for somebody else. So it is from their subjective experience that I'm trying to understand for them what's fun. So going to the next question, of course I would never say कि हमें export करना चाहिए हमारा जो idea है fun का. I think for people living in DHA, the way women in Lyari are having fun is not necessarily fun for them. वो तो गली में नहीं रहते, उनके कपड़े गंदे हो जाएंगे या उनको तकलीफ होगी गर्मी. So we shouldn't be moving very different kind of sets of experiences from one to another, and there's not a hierarchy कि उनका जो experience है वो superior होगा and we should be replicating this for women in Lyari. It's not. So this is, you know, it's ethnography, it's specific. अब आपने एक सवाल किया हम homogenize नहीं करें उनको. Definitely Lyari बहुत diverse है, और मैंने जिन लड़कियों और औरतों की बात की हैं, they're Kachi and some women who are Baloch and from other Sindhi Mahigir communities, fishing communities. तो mixed है, diverse है, but एक thread है कि most of the women I'm talking about are from a particular age group. तो ये एक youth, ज़्यादा youth पे focused है, women who are between the ages of 16 and 25. So these women across ethnic groups, at least from what I've noticed, not exactly the same, but there's some threads we can find, and ये सिर्फ लियारी में apply नहीं कर रही हैं, ये हम पाकिस्तान में मुख्तलिफ context में हमें शायद ये चीज़ें, especially urban context में हमें ये चीज़ें शायद नज़र आएंगी.
No, you should ask.
We have to be gender balanced.
इनको दे दीजिए इनका हाथ पहले.
My name is Akif and I'm from Department of Development Studies. Madam, fun again. आपने अगर आर्टिकल की अपनी बात की 2018 नवंबर में आया था इसी के मुताबिक गाँव में, उसमें अगर देखा जाए तो आपने पूरे आर्टिकल में 22 दफ़ा फन को इस्तेमाल किया है और 4 दफ़ा प्लेजर को इस्तेमाल किया है. आज आपकी पूरी डिस्कशन भी उसी हिसाब से चल रही थी, जबकि आपने एक दफ़ा वायलेंस और पीस का इस्तेमाल किया और इसकी बाइनरी आपने बयान की. द पॉइंट इज़ कि अगर हम देखते हैं फन को इसको अलहदा से इसको हैप्पीनेस से जुदा करते हैं, जो आपने बिल्कुल इस्तेमाल नहीं करना चाह रहे, हैप्पीनेस से जुदा करते हैं इस लफ्ज़ फन को अगर जुदा करते हैं, तो फन अगर हम ग्लोबल नॉर्म्स में देखा जाए तो उस पर क्रिटिक आती है जो क्रिटिक आती है जब वो सो हमारे जो फन लियारी में जो जिस पे आप रिसर्च कर रही हैं कि जब एलीट क्लास के पास जाएगा, जब डिफेंस में जाएगा तो फन बिल्कुल डिफरेंट हो जाएगा. और उनकी क्रिटिक तो ये है कि आप फेमिनिज्म जो है वो इवन क्योंकि वो रेडिकल फेमिनिस्ट हैं, तो वो कहती हैं कि फन जो है वो इवन फेमिनिस्ट को बदनाम कर रहा है, बिकॉज क्योंकि ये चीज़ ग्लोबल नॉर्थ में फन इतनी बुरी तरह से परवान चढ़ रहा है. फन को अगर फेमिनिस्ट कहते हैं कि अगर हम फन ले रहे हैं इन टर्म्स ऑफ so they are enjoying something.
Okay.
They are enjoying.
This is ethnography. I mean, it is contextualized. It varies from space.
नहीं, लेकिन आपका सवाल क्या है?
सवाल ये है कि फन को अगर आप हैप्पीनेस से, क्योंकि आपने कहा है कि हैप्पीनेस भी हासिल हो रही है, क्या उन्हें फन से हैप्पीनेस हासिल हो रही है? क्या फन और हैप्पीनेस दो डिफरेंट चीजें नहीं है?
नहीं, डिफरेंट चीजें नहीं.
फन और हैप्पीनेस दो
मतलब आपको खुशी मिलती है.
प्लेजर और हैप्पीनेस में कोई फर्क नहीं है.
मतलब ये अलग-अलग फीलिंग्स हैं, लेकिन उनका लिंक तो है. आपका सवाल क्या है? मैं समझ नहीं पाया.
हैप्पीनेस गिव्स कंटेंटमेंट.
Okay.
जबकि आपने खुद ही कहा है ये जो हमारा फन है ये हमें एक किस्म की आज़ादी देता है, बट ज़रूरी बात नहीं वो हैप्पीनेस भी दे। मैं अगर एक बात पे कहकहा लगाता हूँ या जोक किसी को मारता हूँ तो उससे ज़रूरी बात नहीं मुझे हैप्पीनेस मिले, मुझे प्लेजर मिलेगा, मुझे फन मिलेगा।
ठीक है, डिफरेंट, ओके।
Okay. I'll just take your point.
नेक्स्ट उनको दे दें।
Considering the prevalence of modesty culture...
Please introduce yourself first.
Okay, my name is Lyari. I am a student. Considering the prevalence of modesty culture, it is easy for women to become victims of slut shaming because among local male population, a woman having fun is usually seen as easy. So what would you say is the easiest way of resisting such harassment that women might face from men?
Okay.
And one more question.
इनको दे दें आप, चेक।
Hi Nida, thank you so much for your presentation. मेरा नाम लैला है, मैं development sector से ताल्लुक़ है। I really enjoyed the presentation and the way you connected the theory and your ethnography. It was very wonderful to learn more about the way this is, fun is working out in different communities. And one of the examples I was thinking of is how इस तरह की ethnography बहुत ज़रूरी है. I think even in development sector जब हम policy की बात करते हैं, क्योंकि for example I recently found out that there was a UNDP project in South Waziristan a few years ago जिसमें उन्होंने औरतों को उनकी आसानी पैदा करने के लिए ना उनको घरों के अंदर ड्रिलिंग करके पानी मुहैया किया, and the women were very upset about it because walking a few miles to get the pani from the kuwa was actually their way of bonding and like sharing gossip and so I think it's quite a expected. I think it's quite what do I want to say? Like it's quite common to see these spaces of fun and pleasure in even violent and otherwise very harsh communities. My question is actually, I know कि आपने यहाँ लियारी के अंदर शीरी community के साथ भी काफी ज़्यादा आपका interaction रहा है, and would you like to speak a little bit about the intersection of that ethnic group with this particular? I know कि आपने बताया कि आपने माहीगीरी community के साथ ज़्यादा काम किया है, but do you see any interesting patterns in the way that the Shiri women or younger Shiri women intersect with this idea of liberation and freedom?
Should I respond?
Yes, please.
नजर नहीं आ रही। अच्छा।
I am student of PhD econometrics at PIDE. My question is simple: is there any sampling technique has been used in this study? Because अगर आपका कोई सैंपल रिप्रेजेंटेटिव नहीं होगा, मीन टू से कि अगर आपने 10 नंबर से इंटरव्यू किया है तो इस कंसेप्ट को फॉलो करते हैं तो फिर तो
एरर हो गया।
ये तो सवाल बहुत ज़रूरी था और बहुत अहम है।
We do techniques, we do follow the sampling technique.
But I was expecting economics में I mean, this is PIDE, so of course economics is like the dominant discipline here, I think. और ठीक है, नहीं I'm not like I totally take your point. मैं जो respond करूँ, there's a lot. Okay.
We have 2 more questions and then.
मेरी capacity इतनी ज़्यादा नहीं है. So I think first question, I'll just take it as a point कि happiness. I mean, I don't know how to respond. These are feelings, right? Affect की जो बात करते हैं वो subjective चीज़ें हैं. Or don't argue. You can argue after. Argue away, but maybe not now. And maybe I didn't understand either. आपका जो point था. Resisting slut shaming, that's very important. कि a lot of times इसमें भी आपको नज़र आता है कि a lot of the women who are engaging in these activities, it's not a straightforward positive activity for them. उसका backlash भी उनको face करना पड़ता है. A lot of women who are doing anything public space, जब भी आप enter करते हैं private space में भी you have to face this kind of backlash, not just from men but also from senior women in the family. So for these young women, there's a lot of consequences for this. They're strategic about it, the sneaking around, doing things on the sly, using social media in creative ways, using clothing in creative ways, trying to find times of the day jahan zyada acceptable hoga ya spaces. These are all ways of strategically navigating around the boundaries. They can backlash, so I mean, even using all of the strategies they have, they also face consequences, and this is very real. So this is something that I think we should be aware of, and that I tried to point out in the end. Iska, you know, it's not just all fun and games. There's definitely a negative impact of this on them as well. But the point that the authors in Why Loiter make is that women should have the right to take risks, right? So agar wo khud karna cha rahi hain, to you know, they shouldn't be stopped if they are willing to take the risk of people talking about them, which they are. So then, you know, why should elders be trying to stop them, or why should conservative religious parties in the locality or whatever try to stop them from that? वो उनका right है. And this is how things will slowly begin to change. Leila, आपका point था कि actually, you know, the Shidi community, this word Shidi is sometimes applied to a very diverse group of people who aren't necessarily Shidi. So लियारी में I think जो community जिसको ज़्यादा attention मिली है वो लोग हैं जो कहीं ना कहीं अफ्रीका से उनके ताल्लुक ancestry है. But as you know, Lyari is really diverse. So even many Baloch people have ancestors who were came over during as part of the slave trade or after. And have African roots, but don't consider themselves to be part of the Shidi community per se. So actually, this label is sometimes misused. Makrani bhi log istemal karte hain, jo wahan ke log unko pasand nahi hai, because Makran is actually just a geographical distinction. Like Makran coast hai, और जो लोग वहाँ से belong करते हैं वो मकरानी होते हैं. They're not necessarily African origin. So it's much more complicated. And one thing is a lot of the women who might have some African ancestry are involved in the boxing, one particular boxing club वहाँ भी मैं थोड़ा सा काम कर रही हूँ. But you know, I don't think उनकी experience इतनी, like, we can't isolate it because Lyari is so diverse and all the groups are also mixing with each other. So yeah, I think that's all.
The last but not the least. No, I would like to ask one question, and that is again related to it's a lovely account that you just gave, and particularly for people who have not been.
Sorry, quantitative का भी मैं answer कर लूँगी. But आप question, नहीं, ask your question then.
Okay, fine. For people who have not been associated or do not know much about Lyari, it was a very interesting account, again related to girls. One thing that I would like to, again as an observation, probably it's there in your paper, but you have not given that much importance to the girls' cafe idea, because that is something that is very innovative, and that is something that you would not find even in like posh localities or even in the middle class or upper middle class localities. And we know that there is a girls' cafe, and what was the nature of the cafe? Was it simply for fun? Was it sort of some sort of a girls' club, or was it supposed to have some other objective, like some community sort of a get-together? What was it all about? Probably you have mentioned it in your paper, but it was not there in your narrative, so this is the reason why I'm asking about the cafe particularly.
Thanks.
And we're taking last question.
Okay.
My name is Isham Muzaffar. I'm from just a question about how could we alter our attitudes, because you mentioned that the group who thinks that women should go out, they have purpose. But then in Islamabad, and of course in Lyari also, there's the other side of society, the other gender which is always out without a purpose and doing nothing. Perhaps a victim or making the other part a victim for their entertainment otherwise. So how could we alter such attitudes? And also you mentioned about the political violence, that the political elite thinks a particular aspect of violence which perhaps sells, and all the other groups of violence are ignored. You mentioned economic violence. So attitude towards that also, that how could both be altered so that even in Islamabad and of course back in Lyari also, we could move forward to a more progressive state, and this idea of violence and fun be enhanced.
So I'm sorry, मैंने आपका जो सवाल था quantitative का, it's very important, and I didn't mean to like make light of it. It's for those of us who do qualitative research, ये question हमें अक्सर face करनी पड़ती है, because we have very different approach to understanding knowledge and data collection. तो हम लोग जो क्वांटिटेटिव अप्रोचेस हैं, एंड आई एम प्रॉबेबली गिल्टी ऑफ दिस एज वेल, कि मैं उनको डिसमिस करती हूँ कि ये व्हाट इज दिस, देयर इज नो कॉन्टेक्स्ट, आप सिर्फ नंबर हमें बता रहे हैं, हाउ डिड यू आस्क द क्वेश्चन, यू हैव टू स्पेंड टाइम विद पीपल टू अंडरस्टैंड देम, सर्वेज में आपको इतना टाइम नहीं मिलता है. और ये जो आइडिया है रिप्रेजेंटेटिवनेस का, ये मेरे ख्याल से इट्स प्रॉब्लमैटिक, बिकॉज देयर इज नो रिप्रेजेंटेटिव पर्सन और ग्रुप. अगर मैं लियारी को देखूंगी तो every locality there has its own diversity, its own history, its own dynamic. But आपका point भी it's well taken कि आपने 10, 15, 20, 50 लोगों से बात की है, तो how can you then say कि लियारी में ये है? तो I don't. I mean, I say कि ये trend मुझे नज़र आ रहा है, मैं 7 साल से वहाँ research कर रही हूँ. Time also makes a difference. आप जितना वक्त कहीं गुजारते हैं तो आप उतना ही समझ सकते हैं उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट को. इट डजेंट मीन कि 100% मेरे पास नॉलेज है. हमेशा मैं कहती हूँ कि सबकी नॉलेज पार्शल होती है, चाहे आपने सर्वे किया या मैंने एथनोग्राफी की है. आई कैन नॉट टेल यू द होल स्टोरी, आई एम टेलिंग यू फ्रॉम माई परस्पेक्टिव. और मेरा परस्पेक्टिव भी लिमिटेड है, जिस तरह से आपका भी लिमिटेड है. सो ऑल वी आर डूइंग इज पुटिंग सम स्लिवर ऑफ सोशल रियलिटी आउट देयर एंड ट्राइंग टू मेक सम काइंड ऑफ theoretical or general points based on that. It's not the whole story. तो मैं भी आपको whole story आज नहीं बता रही हूँ, और ना मैं बता सकती हूँ, even if I lived in Lyari for 1,000 years, you know. So even if you do a survey which includes every single person in Lyari, फिर भी उसकी limitations होंगी. So that's our point, is that, you know, everyone comes at it, and qualitative research के अपने मफादात हैं और quantitative के अपने होते हैं, and we should kind of try to learn from each other rather than saying कि आपका काम limited है क्योंकि आपने सिर्फ नंबर मुझे बताया और आपने सिर्फ 2-4 सवाल पूछे हैं, या आप मुझे कहें कि आपने सिर्फ 10 लोगों से बात की है. आई कैन लर्न अ लॉट फ्रॉम इवन वन पर्सनस लाइफ स्टोरी. आपको बहुत कुछ पता चलता है अगर आपने उस लाइफ स्टोरी को एक कॉम्प्लेक्स तरीके से एनालाइज किया है. तो आपको मेरे ख्याल से यू गेट अ लॉट मोर फ्रॉम दैट than necessarily from a survey with 50,000 people. So I think there's different. So I take your point. I think I was kind of laughing because PIDE is an economics kind of center. तो मुझे पता था कि people will have this kind of reservation, and that's fine. दूसरा, second girls cafe is actually ये जो ये नहीं, लेकिन these women are part of the Lyari Girls Cafe. Its name is a little deceptive. Cafe नहीं है. It has to be, and again उनकी जो locality है, it's particularly conservative. कच्ची community है ज़्यादा वहाँ, और like I said, TLP is the party that's in power there. Jamaat Islami बहुत strong है. People would not feel comfortable if women were just hanging around in a cafe for no reason. So they have to have computer classes, sewing classes, beautician classes. Cafe नाम दिया है, शायद वो एक ट्रेंड भी चला था कैफे का, तो ये NGOization भी हुई है लियारी में बहुत ज़्यादा, तो उसका भी शायद असर है, इसलिए भी कैफे का नाम दिया है, but it's not really a cafe. Third was attitudes. How do we change them? That's the big question, कि हम लोगों की सोच कैसे तब्दील करें. And you made a really good point, and I think I don't mention men a lot in this paper, but the burden for change should not always be on women, right? Women are going in public space, women are taking risks, women are facing backlash, women are facing sexual harassment. Men will have to also change their attitudes too. How we do that, that's a very complex question. Maybe men should help more with trying to figure out how, because as women or as feminists, हम हमेशा बताते रहते हैं कि ये patriarchy है, इसको change करना चाहिए, हमें ये करना चाहिए, but men should also come and say this is how we need to change, this is the best way for us to do this. Burden should not always be on women to bring about the change. And हम ये देख रहे हैं कि change काफ़ी आ गई है in Pakistan, especially urban areas में women are much more mobile, they're entering the workforce, their education levels have gone up a lot. Male attitudes aren't changing as quickly. So they need, you know, that's I think where we're lagging behind. इसीलिए मुझे लगता है कि हमें masculinity पे ज़्यादा बात करनी चाहिए. Next semester में LUMS में भी course पढ़ा रही हूँ masculinity पे, इसी वजह से. Because even as feminists, हम masculinity को नहीं समझते हैं. We don't think it's something we should try to dissect, understand, think critically about, and try to present different models of masculinity that are more progressive, that are more accepting. And I think it's only then we'll be able to imagine a different kind of world.
I have a very, it's more about ethnography. I mean, it's more about the emotions that is taking place in the area, in the urban space. I mean, how do you locate yourself as an ethnographer? Where is your emotionality is basically fit in in this all urban space, your own emotionality.
What do you mean?
I mean, as when we do, research as ethnographer, like we take the voices of the, respondents. So, like we take their emotions, but as a researcher, sometimes we also carry our own subjectivities and sometimes we're more reflexive in our research. So this is how sometimes my own emotionality takes over somebody else's work.
I mean, I think that's why it's very important for us to be reflexive, to be transparent about who we are. मेरा जो background है, वो इन लोगों के background से जिनके बारे में बात करनी was very different, and I take that. That means that my perspective is also different. It's limited in a different way. I try to write myself into the work that I do and try to be transparent about the person I am. मेरी भी emotions उसमें आ रही हैं, मेरा भी interpretation इसमें आ रहा है. So maybe जिस तरह से आपने कहा my idea of fun is different. Maybe मैं अपने idea को impose कर रही हूँ. हो सकता है, right? So I think one should also be aware that your own biases are definitely coming in. हम जितनी भी उस चीज़ को लिमिट करने की कोशिश करें वो चीज़ होती है, and it's okay. I mean, the emotions हम सब के हैं. How do we understand that as part of the research process? I think is a question,
one
important
of the problems
question.
of contemporary ethnographers are they are marred by these emotionalities. Unfortunately, we know basically there are a lot of ethnographers who are marred by these emotions and emotionality when they are in the field. You're right. So reflexivity takes place. So. This is all. We have more questions.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
having
you
me.
very much.